Welcome to Parenting GPS, navigating your parenting journey. I'm Kari Kling, the host and creator of the show. And in the United States of America, October is designated as Bullying Prevention Month. And that's wonderful that we're calling attention to it, but it's not enough. Bullying prevention is something that needs to be talked about every day of the year because we have children out there who are suffering the consequences of being bullied and being a bully. And today, to talk about this with us, we have an incredible expert who probably knows more about this than anybody I've ever known before. And her name is Dr. Susan Swearer, and I'd like to introduce her to you now. Dr. Susan Swearer is the Willa Cather Professor, Chair of the Department of Educational Psychology, and Professor of School Psychology at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. Go Huskers. She is a licensed psychologist, co-director of the Bullying Research Network, and director of the Nebraska Bullying Prevention Intervention Initiative. She received her PhD in school psychology from the University of Texas at Austin and worked with Boys Town in Omaha, Nebraska. Dr. Swearer has authored over 100 book chapters and articles and has written 3 books on the topics of bullying, depression, and anxiety in school-aged youth. Her Target Bullying Intervention Program has been featured on multiple national television shows. Dr. Swearer was invited to be a presenter at the White House Bullying Prevention Conference in 2011 and helped launch Lady Gaga's Born This Way Foundation in 2012 at Harvard University. She toured with Lady Gaga and the Born This Way Foundation on the Born Brave bus, a youth empowerment experience that impacted over 150,000 participants. Dr. Swearer is a supervising psychologist in the Child and Adolescent Therapy Clinic at UNL, and she has devoted her career to the intersection of research and practice in training the next generation of child and adolescent psychologists. Dr. Swearer, thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, thank you so much for Kari for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And, this is something that is a topic that it doesn't seem to matter who you are, where you live, what socioeconomic group you're in, anything, bullying can happen to you. And I want to begin by asking you, you're one of the world experts on bullying prevention. How did you get so involved and become so passionate about this topic?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. So when I started at UNL as an assistant professor in 1997, I was teaching a course and there was a middle school counselor in my class. And she said, we have a big problem with bullying in my school. Can you help us? And so when I was in grad school at UT Austin, my dissertation research was on the comorbidity of depression and conduct disorder in adolescence. So that's when, an individual experiences both conduct disordered symptomatology and depressive symptomatology. And so one symptom of conduct disorder is directly out of the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, is often bullies and threatens and intimidates others. So, as a late 20-year-old, assistant professor, I was like, oh, sure, I can help. And so I actually developed created one of the first longitudinal studies following middle school kids who were involved in bullying over 3 years. So it was a cohort design, and we followed these kids into high school. And, really the main finding from that research project was that bullying is not a dichotomous relationship between a bully and a victim, that it's often much more complicated, and that an individual could be bullied in 7th grade, and then in 8th grade they're the ones who are bullying others. So it's really a fluid kind of behavior, as well as it's just much more complicated. So some kids can be both the bully perpetrator and they can also be bullied themselves. And so we call those kids or those individuals bully victims. So that first study in the late 70s or the late, now I'm really dating myself, the late 19, uh, uh, 1997 showed that bullying is a very complex behavior.
And we're going to talk about some of those cycles and how to help break those before the end of this show. But,
Mhm.
I, excuse me, I'd like to begin also by asking you, when I was going to school and I had a bullying situation in middle school, which I'll share in our second segment. But when I was going to school, when we thought about a bully, we thought about, a verbal or a physical action, maybe on the playground. And bullying has obviously become much more complicated in terms of we have cyberbullying and all kinds of different categories now. How would you define bullying right now? And what are the different categories that we think of bullying in 2023?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Bullying is complex, and the definition that was originally proposed by Dr. Dan Olweus, who was a Norwegian researcher who studied bullying in the late 80s in Norway, he, identified three components of bullying that made it different from, say, an aggressive act. And so those three components are bullying is intentional mean behavior, it's repeated over time. And then it also, there's an imbalance of power. So the person who's being bullied has a hard time defending themselves. And then I'll read the CDC definition. So I'll pull this over. So the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in the United States have adopted this definition and just quote, they define bullying as any unwanted aggressive behaviors by another youth or groups of youth who are not siblings or current dating partners that involves an observed or perceived power imbalance, and is likely to be repeated multiple times. So that definition has really held up since the 1980s. And I use that definition in my work. And, we've found that the imbalance of power is really important because, bullying is also connected to a lot of mental health issues, and those feelings of helplessness
Mhm.
are really part of that imbalance of power.
And so when we think about the kinds of bullying, where that aggressive behavior happens, it's not like I said earlier, what we used to think about, on the playground at school, but in, cyberbullying online. What other areas? And I want to just also say, I know that adults can bully other adults, but for the
Right.
sake of this show, because it's a parenting show and we don't have time to go into all of that in great detail, we're really going to talk about school age children right now. But we know that it's obviously an issue for adults as well. But what other
Yeah.
areas of bullying would you categorize, if any others?
Yeah, so in general, we say there are kind of four forms or types of bullying. So, as you mentioned, verbal bullying, physical bullying, then also relational bullying and electronic bullying, which we also call cyberbullying. So, there's generally four forms, and the research shows that those forms really overlap. So, it's really hard to tease apart verbal bullying and relational bullying and electronic bullying.
Right.
So often those things co-occur together. The research also shows that boys are more likely to engage in physical bullying than girls. However, I did a research project with an all boys school and found high levels of relational bullying. So, again, some people say, well, relational bullying is more of a female issue. And so, in general, I always say bullying is an equal opportunity behavior that cuts across age groups, gender, identity, class. I mean, I've done a lot of research in schools, kind of in private schools, and bullying happens there too. So it really can happen anywhere. And as you mentioned, it can happen in the workplace, but we're just talking about kid issues right now.
Right, right. We'll have to have you back another time to talk about what it looks like from the perspective of an adult. And so you
Mhm,
talked a little bit about it can happen to any group, the gender. And I've done a lot of research and a lot of reading about, the girls and the social climbing. We're going to talk about that more with
mhm,
the idea of social combat in the second segment. But
mhm.
um, what about, I know you've done a lot of research with bullying and children on the spectrum, on the autism spectrum. Do you find that there's more bullying there? What were your findings?
Yeah, so, it's important to also kind of think about the context and the school context and what, how school climate impacts bullying behaviors. And so I've done, research in many, different types of schools across the United States. And in schools where, bullying is really, seen as a taboo behavior and you shouldn't do that, kids who are in special education, so kids who are on the autism spectrum disorder, as well as other students who are in special education, might be a target, for bullying. But in schools where bullying has really been, or is seen as, taboo and something that you don't do, kids would never pick on, other kids who, are seen as different, whether it's a disability or socioeconomic status or whatever. But there is, yes, a lot of research that shows that kids who are seen as different, whether it's a, an observable disability, are more likely to be targets of bullying. But also, we've done research that has shown that kids who have a non-observable disability, so maybe a learning disorder, or depression, anxiety, also can be targets of bullying. And so, in general, kids who are seen as different from the norm or who stand out might be targeted, as well as students or students who are identify as LGBTQIA also are at higher risk. So when I do work with schools and with parents, we always talk about who are those kids who might be potential targets, and then how are we, or how is the school, how are the adults in the school supporting them, and checking in with them.
And when we come back from our break in the second segment, we're going to talk about how do we know if kids are being bullied because they may not tell anybody. So what are the signs and symptoms, and then what can we do about it? So when we come back, we'll begin to address the action part of that plan, and give people some more content and tips and resources and strategies that they can implement within their own school or family. We'll be right back. So in this segment, Dr. Swear, let's start to talk about how do we even know if our children are being bullied? What are the signs and symptoms if they don't come right out and tell you?
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of kids don't want to talk about it because they're embarrassed, whether, they're being bullied or they're bullying others. And so I always encourage parents to create, an environment where their children will talk to them about the struggles that they're having socially. So just simple questions of, who are you, who did you eat lunch with today? What are you doing after school? Just asking about social relationships in general is important. For kids who are being bullied, often, they're embarrassed about it. They might not want to go to school. Parents might see that they seem sad. They're not invited to things. They just say, well, I don't want to do that, or I don't want to, go to activities. So any change in social behavior is worth noting. In terms of students who might be bullying others, if those kids tend not to be invited to things because kids don't want to be around them because they're mean and bullying other kids. So if parents notice that their kids aren't being invited to birthday parties or to events, asking those questions. So just really asking kind of general questions about social relationships. I have a colleague who calls bullying a social relationship problem, and I like to think of it that way as well, that bullying interrupts healthy social relationships. And so if parents notice that their kids are not involved socially, those are some good questions to ask.
Right. And even looking for some of the more tangible things, I would imagine, poor grades, the grades go down, not having an appetite, wanting to stay in their rooms, just differences in behavior and mood. I would imagine.
Well, yeah, exactly, and truancy. And then we also know, I mean, a lot of my work has looked at the connection between bullying and mental health issues.
Right.
And so just what you've mentioned, symptoms of depression, symptoms of anxiety are, signs that, a young person might be involved in bullying as either a target or a perpetrator or both, as I
Hmm.
mentioned before.
And the embarrassment, and also I would imagine the fear. And really quickly, I want to share with you, and I've shared on social media in past months of October when I was focusing on bullying. When I was in the eighth grade, there was a girl, I'll just call her W right now. Um, and she came up to me. She was, much bigger than I was at the time. And she came up to me and she said, well, I'm going to beat you up after school. And I was like, I had never said one word to her in my life. And I was so fearful. And every day she would say, today's the day, today's the day. And one particular, and I never told my mother, I never told a teacher, because I was so petrified that it would escalate the situation, which I think is a problem for a lot of kids. Long story short, my biggest fear, even bigger than being beaten up, was that she would find out where I lived. And so on this particular day when the fight was supposed to happen, I took a different bus home. I had no idea where it was going. I just knew I didn't want to get on my bus. Well, W got on the bus after me. She followed me. And now I was in real trouble because I was on a bus where I didn't even know where it was going. She followed me. And I remember being probably more panicked and fearful than ever in my life. Well, I found out later on when she got off the bus, it was her regular bus. I did not know that at the time, but she never did beat me up, and everything dissipated after a couple of weeks. And I still don't know whatever brought it on, but the longevity of that fear. And as I shared with you before we started recording, at my 10-year high school reunion, my 20-year high school reunion, even though I knew she couldn't hurt me and I was no longer afraid of her, I was watching for her. And
Hmm.
so I want to ask you about two things about that. The fear that so many kids, and I never told my mother ever, 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 ever. I never really voiced it until a couple of years ago. So how do we help kids recognize that it's better to tell a trusted adult and not fear that escalation? Um, if they do tell.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. And in my work with, children and young people, they say the same thing, that they don't tell because they're fearful that it will get worse or, they'll be called a snitch, they'll lose, social status. So there really is this kind of secrecy that kind of can surround, bullying. And so again, I think it's incumbent on the adults to create an environment where, kids can feel like, "Oh, okay, I can talk about this and not fear, reprisal." And so it seems very simple, but I think, it means a lot to say to kids, I just want you to tell me if something's going on. And if you want me to do something, you can tell me that you want me to do something. If you want me just to keep it private and you just want to vent, that's fine as well. And so I think when we give kids permission to share what's happening without then worrying that, oh, my parent's going to freak out and go to the school and it's going to be worse. A lot of times, people just want someone to talk to. So again, creating those opportunities for having conversations about, what's going well, what's not going well, and as an adult, do you want me to, get involved or do you just want to talk about it? So I think it's important to create an environment where kids don't worry that, okay, you're gonna, like if I'm telling my parents something, they're gonna, freak out, go to the school, and it's gonna be a lot worse. I always talk to parents about creating environments where their kids will share things with them, without fear of, the parent getting upset or, making it worse.
Right. And so what I'm hearing you say is give that child some control, and some choice about this situation, about how they want the parent to perhaps help them problem solve it, but not necessarily, you know, as a knee-jerk reaction, run to the school.
One of the programs that I've developed is the Target Bullying Intervention Program that works with students who perpetrate, bullying behaviors to try to get them to understand that these behaviors are harmful and hurtful, and how can they behave in a more pro-social positive way. And
So
so
yeah,
obviously, if we can help kids not bully, then we don't have an issue with bullying.
right. So it's not just about punishment, it's about helping them understand, which leads me to my next thought is that there's a very common saying about hurt people hurt people. And
Mhm.
so we have to say, why is the person bullying in the first place? What is going on emotionally within themselves to force them, if you will, or cause them to behave this way toward another human being? So how do we help break that cycle?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question and a great observation. Aggressive behavior is a heritable trait. And so we know that kids who grow up in households where there's lots of aggression being modeled, they're more likely to be aggressive. It's the famous Bobo doll, experiment. So so there is that connection, but like with everything in psychology, there's not a one-to-one correlation between observing aggression and being aggressive, yourself. And so not all kids who bully grow up in households where there's aggressive behavior, but by and large, most kids who are involved in bullying have some, kind of, mental health issue, they've observed aggressive behavior working, they live in aggressive environments, whether it's, home, school, community. This behavior is a complicated result of lots of different factors.
And you just mentioned, and I want to elaborate on what you just said, but you mentioned about the famous Bobo doll experiment. And for those viewers that may not know what that is, could you give us just a really quick overview so people will know what you're referring to?
Yeah, so Albert Bandura, who was a psychologist at Stanford University, was interested in why are kids aggressive? And so the Bobo doll, which was a inflatable, you know, like punching bag doll, he then, observed kids in the lab and noticed or, studied the fact that when kids observed aggressive behavior, they were more likely to be aggressive toward the Bobo doll. So it's called social, learning theory that, when we observe a behavior, we're more likely to repeat it.
Yeah, and I know there were some earlier studies back in the 60s about cartoons, and then children watching cartoons where they're bopping, each other over the head, and then they go play with their friends, and those behaviors um, are sometimes evident. But you talked about this cycle, and I know that there's a term called social combat, which has to do with the hierarchy of status, if you will, within children, and why some people bully. Would you elaborate on that for us, please?
Yeah, so Robert Ferris, who's a sociologist at UC Davis, has come up with that term. And what he observed and studied in kids was that there was this kind of social hierarchy. So, if an unpopular kid engaged in, kind of bullying and socially combative behaviors, they then rose in popularity. Once they kind of achieved that status, then they were less likely, to engage in bullying. And so he wrote about this phenomenon and called it social combat, and
Mhm.
how kids engage in, kind of basically dominance behaviors. And so dominance theory in psychology also kind of addresses this underlying, some of the underlying reasons why somebody might engage in bullying. So, I always say to parents and to teachers, as adults, we say to kids, bullying is bad, in, just being
Right.
general. And kids are like, not really, because if I'm getting, more popular or I'm getting more friends because I'm doing this behavior or my friends are all doing this, it's actually not that bad for me socially.
Hmm.
So I think it's really important for us as adults to understand the complexity behind reasons why kids might engage in bullying. And for us just to say, well, it's bad. And they're like, well, maybe not really.
Hmm.
We need to kind of help. And then part of what we try to do in the intervention program that I've developed is help kids understand that, it's hurtful.
Right.
So even though you might be gaining something socially out of it for yourself, for the other person or people, it's a hurtful behavior. And do you want to engage in that kind of behavior?
Right. And when you said about it kind of raises their social level, would you say that's in the eyes and perspective of the person who's being the bully, or from the other people, and perhaps they're afraid of the person, so they kowtow to them a little bit?
Well, yeah, exactly. And so it is kind of, like we have that phrase, beauty is in the eye of the beholder.
Right.
Some kids who are bullying don't really realize they are, or they don't realize how other people perceive them. And so that was kind of tied to my comment about for parents, if their children aren't being invited to things,
Right.
to activities, that could be be a sign. Or also recognizing, I mean, I've had parents call me and say, my God, I had no idea, my child was bullying others. I'm devastated. What do I do?
Right.
And so really helping, the adults in kids' lives help kids understand what are, better ways to behave. And unfortunately, we see this on social media or frankly, the media. There are lots of models of aggressive behavior that are being rewarded. And so,
Absolutely.
how do we kind of combat that?
Exactly. And I was going to say that, with social media, the age of the child who's looking at things that are inappropriate seems to be getting younger and younger, and they can't always differentiate between what's appropriate and what's not appropriate if they're not mature enough to recognize what's even happening. And so as we sum
Mhm.
up a little bit, we could talk about this for 2 hours. I realize that we're not talking about everything, but as we sum up before we go to our questions from our viewers, some of the things that you've talked about, what I'm hearing you say is, first of all, really work on that communication with your child and let them know that you are there, that they are the trusted adult. Um, and if for some reason you can't be there, help them find a trusted adult at school, or wherever the bullying is happening, to talk to, and to recognize that it's not just about punishing the child, it's about what's going on inside and how do we change that cycle. um, what else would you like the parents or the viewers, grandparents, educators, anybody watching to know, just kind of, bullet.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we know from years of research that zero tolerance policies in schools and punishment don't work.
Mhm.
Yet, what do most people turn to when there's an aggressive situation or a bullying situation? It's often punishment. People want, to be very simplistic, they want the bully to be punished. And I've always argued that that is not going to change behavior. And I mean, it's not even just an argument. I mean, research shows that's not going to change behavior. How do we take the time, or we need to take the time to work with the kids who are doing the bullying, the kids who are being bullied to help support them to engage in more pro-social positive behaviors?
Right. So teaching those strategies and really trying to help them for the rest of their lives, and also, and not just putting them away and saying, okay, if you are suspended, you're going to, fall further behind in school. It's going to be worse with the friends, but protecting those kids, and knowing that they can feel safe that are being bullied. And when we come back from our break, Dr. Swear, we have two very specific questions that, our viewers wrote in that I'd like to ask you.
Sure, that'll be great.
We'll be right back. This is the part of the show where we help our viewers, our parents, and also lots of grandparents, find the answers to their questions. And in keeping with the navigation theme of parenting GPS, I like to call it your parenting destination. And Dr. Swear, as I mentioned, we have two questions today. We actually had more than that, but only time for two. And the first question is from Richie P. from Stockton. And Richie wants to know if there are any laws in any states that make bullying illegal.
So, a great question. There are no laws that make bullying illegal, but there are laws about discrimination and harassment. And so, when bullying, in a way crosses the line into discrimination, harassment, sexual harassment, there are laws that protect people against those behaviors. There's a great website, cyberbullying.org, where parents can go click on their state and see what are the policies that each state has adopted. So each state has laws and policies regarding bullying, but they're not illegal. Bullying is not considered an illegal behavior.
Great. And parents, educators, grandparents, again, look at that site if you want to know more specifically what's going on in your state where you live. And for those of you who are watching globally, I would encourage you just look and see if you have any of those sites within your government's, your country, and see what it says. I'm not aware, I don't know to direct you. Our second question today is from Rachel R. from Mesa, Arizona, not too far from me. And Rachel's question is this. Now we're going to talk about college. We talked about school aged up to high school really before. My son attends a state university here in the Southwest. He feels like he is being bullied by one of his professors in the sense that he's being asked to write papers based on one political perspective. The professor says things like, I know nobody in this class would agree with that person, and then names a political figure. But my son does agree with that person. He's afraid to go to the dean for fear that the dean will either agree with the professor or that the professor will find out and that he'll get in trouble and not pass the class. Do you have any recommendations of what my son can do?
Yeah, I mean, this is certainly tricky because of academic freedom in colleges and universities, across the country. And so when students feel that they can't express their viewpoint, to me, that's kind of flies in the face of what higher education is all about. But in terms of answering the question, what I would recommend if this was, say, a student in my department, I would recommend that the student talk to, either another professor or the chair of the department, and really, say, and maybe not even name the professor, but just say, this is something that's happening. What are my options? Most universities have an OMSBud program where people can go and, kind of express, a concern like this. And so I would encourage the student to look at their university's, kind of conflict resolution options and see if there's an OMSBud program for students. My university has one. That's a great option. I also tell students to fill out the anonymous course surveys. And so students often feel that the course surveys are not going to go anywhere or do anything. And that's just absolutely not true. So as chair of a department, I read every single, student course, survey, course evaluation of all of the faculty in my department. And so I would encourage the student to fill out, the course survey, which is anonymous, and log this information, or, express this information, and then also check to see if there's an OMSBud program at that university.
Okay, well, Rachel, we hope that helps you with your son. And it's a complicated world out there for sure. And Dr. Swear, I wish we had more time. You are a wealth of information, and I know you have so much to share. Where can our viewers find out more about you, about your programs? What are your websites, any social media, anything that you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook. So people can find me there. I run the Nebraska Bullying Prevention and Intervention Initiative. And so we have a website. They can just Google the Nebraska Bullying Prevention and Intervention Initiatives. I also have worked with, as you mentioned in the beginning, Lady Gaga's Born This Way Foundation. Born This Way Foundation's website also has a ton of information that people can find. And so I encourage people to feel free to reach out to me. And if I don't know the answer, I will try to point them in the right direction.
Well, that's awesome, and I bet, being on that bus with Lady Gaga, I bet that was just a really unforgettable time for you, and you helped so many people.
Well, thank you. It was amazing to see the work that the foundation, did in the early days and continues to do in youth mental wellness and health. And Lady Gaga and the foundation are passionate about, elevating the voices of young people and creating a kinder and braver world.
It's all about empowering our youth. And before we close with a quote from you, I have something that I'd like to share with our viewers. If you would like to have this, it is complimentary. It's something that I created years ago, about tips to help your child. And I encourage you to put this up in multiple places in your home, so on the refrigerator, in your child's bedroom, wherever, so that they remember. And you can get this tips site, or this tip sheet, at my website at karikling.com. Just go to the blue banner on the top and click on it, and one will automatically be sent to you and download. And it's all the things that we talked about. Tell a trusted adult. It's not about you. It's about the person who's doing the bullying. Recognizing that people who are hurting hurt people. And then finally, the S is stand up for others. And we didn't talk about that as much as I would like to. But if you see people bullying other people, don't just ignore it. If you see someone being hurt, tell a trusted adult, let them know, so that that child isn't suffering by themselves. And perhaps help can be there to help empower that person and protect them. And so once again, Dr. Swear, thank you so much for doing what you do, being who you are, and spending time with us today. And I'd like to close with a quote from you. And I believe this was part of the Born This Way Foundation. You said it when you were on the tour with Lady Gaga, and you said, "We know that kindness and bravery are the keys to stop bullying." With
Yes.
that, if
So
today's show helps one person, we did our job. Thank you so much.
absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on.
It's my pleasure.